Hey friends, 1 second, do I need a cough? Alright, what do you want me to tell you? I'm almost better, not totally. Yeah, I've blown my nose so much over the past week that my nose is sore. Anyways, yeah, what do you want me to tell you? Still got like a little, yeah, you see, a little tiny cough. What do you want me to tell you? Alright friends, how's everybody doing? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Gimel, Daf 3 of Masechta Moed Katan. Friends, how's Moed Katan going so far? It's going good, right? Yeah, it's good. We gotta use our brains a little bit. It's nice. We're going to continue talking about Shemitah today, because of course it came up in our Mishnah that we said that you're allowed to provide water to a Beis HaShlochin, to a field that requires irrigation on Chol HaMoed. So we're going to continue with that discussion and then some other halachos about Shemitah. Friends, let us jump in and begin on Daf Beis Amud Beis, 2 lines from the bottom. Rava Omar Afilu Tema Rabbanon. You can even say it's the rabbis. What does that mean? Because we had asked the kasha. We had asked the question that, well, our Mishnah says that you're allowed to provide water to a Beis HaShlochin, to a field that requires irrigation on Chol HaMoed, but also on Shemitah. And the question is, why? Why are you allowed to water a field on Shemitah? So Abai wanted to say, well, because our Mishnah is like the opinion of Rebbe, that Shemitah nowadays is only Midir and because it's Midir so if your field is going to get ruined because it requires irrigation, if you don't irrigate it's going to get ruined. So they said that would be, you'd be allowed to irrigate a Beis HaShlochin on Shemitah. Now, Rava says that it could even be the opinion of the rabbis, which is that Shemitah nowadays is taka midoraisa. Rava Omar Afilu Tema Rabbanon. You can even say that our mission is in accordance with the rabbis. Well, then how come you're allowed to be watering a field on Shvius, on Shemitah, if Shemitah B'zman Hazeh is midoraisa? So, Avos Asur Achmana Toladus Lo Achsur Achmana. You can make the argument that the Torah says that the avos, right, when it comes to Shabbos, we learned Masechta Shabbos, there are avos melachos and tolados. They're sort of the parent categories and the child categories, and we want to say that on Shemitah only the avos are asur, the tolados are not, and therefore watering, I guess, would just be a tolada. Watering seeds would just be a tolada, a child melacha, and that would be allowed on Shemitah. Alright. The pasuk says, Vashana Ashvius, on the 7th year, Shabbos Shabboson Yeh La'aretz, it will be a year of rest for the land. Sod Cholosizra V'Gomer. Right? So the pasuk says, Sod Cholosizra V'chaim Cholosizmor, do not seed your field, do not prune your vineyard. And then continues the pasuk, Esfiach Kitzircha Lo Siktzor V'Esin V'Nizrecha Lo Sivtzor, do not harvest the aftergrowths of your field or your grapes. So we're mentioning over here seeding, pruning, harvesting, and harvesting grapes. So Michdei, let's see. Zmira Bichlal Zriya. Pruning is kind of included in Zoreah, in seeding, because why do you prune? You remove the bad branches so that the good branches are going to grow stark, are going to grow better, which is like Zriya, which is why you plant something so that it can grow. Uvtzira b'chlal ktsira. And Bitsira, which is harvesting grapes, is basically included in Kitsira, in harvesting. Right? She said harvesting is by grain, and Bitsira is by Kotzer is by grain, and Botzer is by grapes. Well, if Bitsira is included in Zriya if Zmira is included in Zriya and Bitsira is included in Ktsira, so then how come they are specifically listed in the Torah? Lememra, it's to say to you, Dahani Tolados Mechayev Achvanyosa Lo Mechayev. Because what the Torah is saying by going out of its way to mention Bitsira and to mention Zemira, to teach us that specifically by Botzer and specifically by Zomer, that by pruning and by harvesting grapes, those are tolados, those are child malachas that you are chayiv for, but not any other child malachas, and therefore watering a beis hashlochen, which is a child malacha, it's a tolada, so that would be permitted. Okay, that's what Rava wants to argue. In fact, the Gemara, but 1 second, is that really true that these child malachas, you're exempt from on Shvius? We learn in a Brisa. Now we're going to mention a whole bunch of child malachas. We'll see if I can remember how to translate them. Okay, of course the pasuk says, do not seed your field and do not prune your vineyard. In the zerua v'zimur, all I know is seeding and pruning. How do I know that nichush we saw yesterday, weeding, uleidur, and softening ground around like grapes, I think, v'likisuach, and mowing lawn. All right. How do I know that those things are also not allowed on Shvius, on Shemitah? Sadcha lo, kaimucha lo. It says in the pasuk, Sadcha lo sizmor, right? Chaimucha, what was it? Sadcha lo sizra, chaimucha lo sizmor. So Sadcha lo, right? Not your field, kaimucha lo, not your vineyard. Lo kol melacha shebesadcha, none of the melachas that you do in your field. V'lo kol melacha shebekaimecha, and none of the melachas that you do in your vineyard. So therefore, not nichush either and kisuach either. Minayin she'en mekarsmin, ve'en mezardin, ve'en mefaskin. How do we know that we're not mekarsmin? Who could tell me what mekarsmin is? That's it's basically pruning, but for trees. All right, that sounds fun. Pruning for trees. All right. Ve'ein mezardin. What's mezardin? That you remove branches, not just the bad branches, but even some of the good branches, because there are just too many. Ve'ein mefaskin. That's to support a tree that's shtikol shvach. Ba'ilon. Okay, with a tree. Therefore the pasuk says, not your field, not your vineyard. Lo kol melacha shebesadcha, none of the melachas that you do in your field. V'lo kol melacha shebekaimecha, and none of the melachas that you do in your vineyard. Okay, so none of these things. Minayin she'en mezablin. How do we know that we don't fertilize? Fertilize? I think that's the word. Fertilize. When you put fertilizer on the field, right? Alright, what do I mean to tell you? Vein mefarkin, and we don't remove stones. Vein ma'avkin, and we don't. What was ma'avkin again? Ma'avkin sheshoshev nir muchasim also ba'avak. That if the roots are visible, so then you cover it with dirt. Vein ma'ashnin ba'ilon, and you don't burn some kind of a fire so that the smoke would kill bugs or whatever. So once again, the pasuk says, right, not your field, not your vineyard. Lo kol melacha shebesadcha lo, kol melacha shebekaimecha lo. None of the field in your field, none of the field in your vineyard. All right, fine. Yachol lo yikashkesh tachas hazesim. It's possible that you shouldn't soften the ground under olives. V'lo ya'ader tachas hakafanim, and you shouldn't soften the ground under grapevines, and you shouldn't fill up, if there are cracks, I guess, in the tree or somewhere else, you shouldn't fill it up with water. You shouldn't make these water receptacles underneath the grapes. Therefore the pasuk says, do not seed your field. Zriya b'chlal haisa. So Zriya Zorea was initially included in just don't do any malachas of the field. Vilama Yatzusah, how come Sizra, right? How come Zriya was singled out, even though it just said, right, Shabbos and Yelarts, that it should be a year of rest? How come we have to mention seeding? Lahakish Elea, to compare it to seeding, just like seeding is an avoda, it's a malacha that you do both in a field and in a vineyard. So therefore, the things that you have to refrain from doing on Shemitah are things that apply both to a field and a vineyard, and as opposed to these other things that are specific to olives or to grapes, things like that. Right? In order for it to be a problem, it has to be things that are relevant both in fields and in vineyards. Okay, friends, what was the point of that? The point of that was that we see that there are all sorts of toladus that we have to refrain from doing on Shemitah. So how could Rava be making the argument that the only thing that's not allowed on Shemitah is the avos, but the toladus are allowed? Here we have a brisa listing a whole bunch of toladus that we're saying you're not allowed to do on Shemitah, and for Tigmar midrabanan v'kras machta ba'alma. Yeah, that's midrabanan. Midrabanan, we don't do all of these toladus. That pasuk the pasuk of sadchalo karmachalo, the drasha, it's just an asmachta. Right, the rabbis are basing their rabbinic decree on psukim, but it's not actually mida oraisa. But now, affecting Gemara, v'kishkush b'shviyis mishari. Are you allowed to really soften the ground under trees by olives on Shemitah? Because we had just said a few lines earlier. Is it possible that you cannot soften the ground under the olives? And we said no, you're allowed to soften the ground under the olives. But v'kishkush b'shviyis mishari, are you really allowed to soften the ground under olives? V'yaksiv, but the pasuk says v'ashviyis tishmitenu netashta, that on Shemitah you gotta let the land rest and you abandon it. Tishmitenu milekashkesh, you let it rest from softening the ground under olive trees, unitashta, and you have to abandon it milasakel, from like removing stones and stuff. Amar Rav Ukva bar Choma, says Rav Ukva bar Choma, look, there's two different types of softening ground. So one type of softening the ground is in order to make the olive tree better. The other one is in order to sort of, if there were like splits or cracks or whatever, so then the soft ground, I guess, would fill it up. So you're not allowed to make a tree better on Shemitah. You gotta kind of leave it alone. But to fill in cracks where it would actually get harm, so then that would be permitted. All right, fine. What do you want me to tell you? It was stated, Hachorish b'shviyis, a fellow who plows on Shemitah. All right. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar. So machlokas Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar. Charomar loka, v'charomar eino loka. So one opinion is that we whip him. He gets malchus, we whip him. And the other is that we don't whip him. We find something else to keep us busy. Lema b'drab oven om Rabbi Ila kamiflige. And let's say that Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar are arguing based on the sort of approach of Rabbi Oven Rabbi Ila, the Rabbi Oven Rabbi Ila, that Rabbi Oven Rabbi Ila says, friends, did you hear what just happened? Who can tell me what a klal ufrad uchlal is? Klal ufrad uchlal is basically when you have a general rule, a specific rule, followed again by a general rule. So, for example, Shabbos Shabboson yeh la'aretz, right? What does the pasuk say? Uvashana ashviyis Shabbos Shabboson yeh la'aretz. It should be a year of rest for the land. So that's a klal. That's sort of a general rule. There's no specifics there other than the fact that you got to rest. It's kind of general. Now we start going into specifics. Sod cholo sizra v'chaim cholo sizmor esvech tzircha lo siktzor v'zinvedin zirecha lo sivtzor. There's a lot of details over there, right? What do we said? Don't seed, don't prune, don't harvest, right? Those are specific things. And then it says shnas Shabboson yeh la'aretz. It should be a year of rest. So we see that first we talk about rest, and then we give it into specific details, and then once again we talk about rest. So that's what's called the klal ufrad uchlal. A general rule followed by specific rules, followed by general rule. So Reb Oven wants to say that when you have a general rule, Reb Oven Reb Ila wants to say that when you have a general rule followed by a specific rule, but the general rule is a positive commandment, such as Shabbos, Shabboson, Yeh La'aretz, and then followed by the specifics, which are negative commandments, which is like Sodcha lo sizra, I keep on forgetting what it is. Sodcha lo sizra, Chaimcha lo sizma, those are loci, says, don't do this, don't do that. So it says, it says, whenever you have a general rule that is a positive commandment, such as over here, Shabbos Shabboson Yeh La'aretz, followed by ufrat below saise, followed by a specific rule which is a negative commandment, such as over here, right? Sadcha lo sizra, don't do this. Ein done it also b'chlal ufrat u'chlal. We don't treat it as a klal ufrat u'chlal. What does that mean? So how does this stuff work? So what's a klal ufrat? A klal ufrat is a general rule followed by a specific rule. And the way that works is that general rules, of course, include everything, right? Shabbos, Shabboson Yeh La'aretz. It should be a year of rest that implies all sorts of rest. But then we start listing specific things, right? Sadcha lo sizra, Chaimcha lo sizmor, etc. So now we start getting to specifics. So if it would stop right there, we would have what's called a klal ufrat, a general rule followed by a specific rule. And in that case, the general rule is limited entirely to the specifics. So klal ufrat means that you start out with a general rule, Shabbos, Shabboson, it should be a year of rest, but then we give specific examples, Sadcha lo sizra, Chaimcha lo sizmor. So that means that it's only limited to seeding your field and pruning your vineyard, and also, harvest, right? It said harvesting your grain and your grapes. So it would be entirely limited to those things that are listed. However, it's followed once again by Shnas Shabboson Yeh La'aretz, another klal, another general rule. So this is not just a klal ufrat, it's a klal ufrat u'chlal. It's a general rule followed by a specific rule, followed once again by a general rule. So what happens is, in this case, when there's another general rule, it's saying that it's not only those specific things that were mentioned, right, those details that were mentioned, but anything similar to them. So whereas if you would only have a general rule, so that would include absolutely everything. When it's followed by specifics, that means that the general rule is limited entirely to those specific examples. But if it's followed once again by a general rule, so then it opens up those specific examples to say that, well, it's not just those specific examples, but anything similar to those specific examples. So somewhere in the middle, right? Like general, the first klal kind of includes everything. The specifics kind of limit it to the specifics. But if it's followed by another general rule, so that kind of like creates like a middle kind of space where it's includes not absolutely everything, but anything similar to those details. So now, if we say that the point of plowing is in order to sort of improve the field, so then if we have a klal ufrat u'chlal, and we say that included in this general rule is anything similar to the specifics, so then I would include harvesting. I would include chorish, and say that you're not allowed to harvest on Shemitah, and if you do, you get whipped. So there you go. So let's start again. Itmar was stated, Achorish b'ashvi is somebody who plows on Shemitah. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar, Machlokas Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar, Chad Omer loke, v'chad Omer eno loke. One of them says that the fellow is going to get malchus for, you're going to whip him because he plowed on Shemitah, and the other one says, no, we don't whip him. So let's say that they're machlokas about whether we whip a fellow who plows on Shemitah. Let's say that this machlokas is based on Rabbi Oven Amar Rabbi Illa. The Amar Rabbi Oven Amar Rabbi Illa, that whenever you have a general rule that's a positive commandment and specifics that are a negative commandment, ain't done it also b'chlal ufrat u'chlal, well then you can't say klal ufrat u'chlal. In order to say klal ufrat u'chlal and to say that the second general rule is coming to include anything similar to the specifics, you have to have either all asays or all lota asays, but not klal with an asay and a prat with a los asay. Manda Amr loke leis le derb oven. So the Manda Amr who says that we whip the fellow, so clearly he's saying that things that are similar to seeding and pruning are also not allowed, i.e., that we treat it as a klal ufad uchlal, which means that he does not hold of Rabbi Illa, who says that since the klal is positive and the prat is negative, Rabbi Illa would say that Rabbi Avnam Rabbi Illa would say that you can't use it as a klal ufad uchlal. But if you say that you get malchus, it sounds like we're including it as a klal ufad uchlal. Okay, fine. So the one who says that you get malchus leis le de Avnam Rabbi Illa, madomer eino loke, and the opinion who says that we do not whip the fellow is le de Avin. He holds of Reb Avin, and because he holds of Reb Avin, so then it's not a klal ufrat uchlal, and therefore we do not include plowing, and therefore you would not, the fellow would not get whipped. All right, fine. So the Gemara says, no. Now nobody holds like Reb Avin Amar Reb Illa. Nobody holds like Reb Avin Amar Reb Illa. And therefore, even though the klal is a positive commandment and the prat is a negative commandment, it doesn't matter. It's a klal ufrat uchlal, and therefore we include anything similar to seeding, i.e., we would include malchus. We would include plowing, that you would get malchus. So manda omer loka shapers. According to the opinion who says that, right, that you get malchus. I know I said a minute ago, but basically we include plowing in the things that are not allowed on Shemitah, and therefore according to the opinion who says that you get whipped if you plow, so it makes sense, because plowing is one of the things you're not allowed to do. According to the opinion that you do not get whipped for plowing, he'll say to you, like we said earlier, that pruning is included in seeding, and harvesting grapes is included in harvesting olives, harvesting grain. So how come then the Torah went out of its way to mention pruning and harvesting grapes? So the Meimar to say ahane the ahane tolados hudi michayev atolada achvinu lo michayev, that is davka chayev for these tolados of pruning and of harvesting grapes, but not any other tolados, and therefore what? Who could tell me? And therefore he wouldn't be chayev malchus, right? So therefore, even if you plow, which you're not allowed to do, but you would not be chayev malchus for that. All right, what do you want me to tell you? Vilo, you wouldn't be chayev malchus, wouldn't be aser. V'atane, but we learned in a brisa, as we learned earlier, sod cholo sizah v'chaim cholo sizmor. Right, do not seed your field, do not prune your vineyard. Ein li ela zeru v'zimor. All I know is that I'm not allowed to seed, I'm not allowed to prune. Minayin li'idur u'likishkush u'lichisuach. How do I know that I'm also not allowed to soften the land, the ground, by the grapevines, or to soften the ground by olives? V'likisuach, and mowing the lawn. Right, not your field, not your vineyard. Local malacha shebesadcha, none of the malachas, the activities in your field. Local malacha shebekarmecha, none of the activities in your vineyard. How do we know that we don't prune by trees, and how do we know that we do not get rid of like good branches and bad branches, because there are too many of them, and we don't sort of support a shvach tree. Not your field, not your vineyard. None of the activities that you do in your field, none of the activities that you do in your vineyard. How do I know that we do not fertilize the field? We don't we don't like get rid of any stones and stuff. And we don't kind of burn stuff so that the smoke will kill like bugs. Not your field, not your vineyard. You're not allowed to do any of the malacha in your field, not allowed to do any of the malacha in your vineyard. Is it possible you shouldn't soften the land under olives? You shouldn't soften the land under grapes. You can't fill up any of these cracks, these splits with water. And you shouldn't make like these water hole things around grapes. It says, do not seed your field. Zriya seeding was included in sort of the general rule of that, let the land rest. How come seeding specifically was mentioned? To compare to it, just like seeding is something that you do both in a field and in a vineyard. Also, any work that you do, the only things you're going to be chayav for are the things that you do both in your field and your vineyard. So we see from here that it's not just the tolados of pruning and of harvesting grapes that you're chayav for. You are chayav for anything that is done in your field and your vineyard. So how come then we're saying that you're only chayav for the tolados of pruning and for harvesting grapes? So midrabanan because machta ba'alma. This brisa that is saying that you're chayav for all of these tolados, that's really just midrabanan, and these psukim are just like asmachtas, things that the rabbis relied upon, but they're not actually midoraisa. Says the Gemara, Kiyasar Rav Dimi Omar. Oh, so when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he said, Yachol yilaka ala toisvis v'nosav la tamud leftura. All right. So when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he said, look, that he heard something about, will you be chayav for tosvis, for adding on something, v'nosav la tamud leftura? And the answer is no, you're going to be potter. V'lo yadaina my tamuda my ptura. What? V'lo yadaina my tamuda my tosefes. He says he doesn't know exactly like what this means. Meaning, Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel. He said that apparently there was a question about if you should be chayiv malchus for some kind of a tosefes, some kind of adding on to something, and the answer is no. He doesn't know what they're talking about. So Rabbi Elazar Amar. So Rabbi Elazar says charisha v'achika Amar. So Rabbi Elazar says, what's this tosefes? This addition is talking about plowing. That kilu, of course, plowing was not one of those specific things that were listed, right? We mentioned seeding, we mentioned pruning. Plowing was not mentioned. We added it through the klal ufaru klal. V'achika Amar. And this is what Rav Dimi, he heard about this addition and it's potter, he doesn't know what it's talking about. Hachika Amar, this is what it means. Yachol yilaka ala charisha. Is it possible that you'll be chayiv malchus for plowing, which is one of those things that are additionally not done on Shemitah that we learn out through the klal ufaru klal? The asim klal ufaru klal v'nosav le'tamud leftura. And we say no, yutaka potter, you will not be chayiv malchus for plowing. To imkain kolani prate lamali. Because if you're chayiv malchus for plowing, then what's the point of specifying pruning and harvesting grapes? What was the point of specifying those if you're going to be chayiv malchus even for plowing, which wasn't specified? So therefore the point is that no, specifically by those things you're going to be chayiv malchus for, but not by plowing. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Yomim She'osifu. Rabbi Yochanan says that when we talk about the addition, we're talking about the days that they added on to Shemitah. Of course, Shemitah is just the 7th year. However, they added on that already prior to the 7th year, you stop, working your fields. So Rabbi Yochanan Amar Yom She'osifu Chacham Lifnei Rosh Hashanah, that it's the days that the rabbis added prior to Rosh Hashanah of Shemitah that already you stop working your field. V'achika Amar, and this is how to understand what Rav Dimi was sort of the quandary of Rav Dimi. Yachol yilaka al tosvis Rosh Hashanah. Is it possible that you'll get malchus if you violate the addition to Rosh Hashanah, to the addition to Shemitah, that already prior to Shemitah prior to the beginning of Shemitah already you stop working the field? But is it possible that if you work the field prior to Rosh Hashanah of Shemitah, we will whip you? So the asimi b'char shuvakatsu tishbos. which we learn out from Bachar Shavakatsu Tishbos, as we're going to see later on the page, that basically from Bachar Shavakatsu Tishbos, that is how we learn out, and again, we're going to learn it on later on the page, that is how we learn out that you already prior to when Shemitah starts, already from before then, you stop working the fields. And the answer is no, you will not be chayiv malchus if you work your field prior to Rosh Hashanah of Shemitah, as we are going to learn out a little bit later. Rosh Hashanah. What are these days prior to Rosh Hashanah that we do not work the field? Because it's not, as we learn in a Mishnah, Ad Mosai Chorshin B'Sdei Ilon Erev Shvius. Until what point can you plow in a field of trees prior to, right, on the Erev Shvius, on the eve of Shvius, of Shemitah? B'Shamai Kozman Sheyofel Pri. B'Shamai says, as long as it's good for the fruit. Once it's no longer good for the fruit, then you have to stop plowing. B'Sil Omrim Ad Ha'atzeres. B'Sil says until you could plow until Shavuos. And they're very similar to each other. Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai's opinion are very similar, very close. Ve'ad Mosai Chorshin Sdei Alavan. What about a wheat field? Until what point can you plow a wheat field on Erev Shvius? So Mishetichle Alecha, until it stops raining. Once it stops raining, so then you can no longer plow the wheat field. V'chozman shebnei adam chorshim lite mikshos umadlos. And as long as people are still plowing in order to plant squashes and gourds, alright, fine, that sounds nice. So Reb Shimon Omer says, Reb Shimon Imkain, but one second, if we're saying that the time that you can plow your wheat fields are as long as people are plowing for squashes and gourds, well, that's a sort of subjective time, right? Nosna Torah shiur l'chol echad ve'echad b'yadam, right? Everyone has sort of a separate time about when they're going, right? You know, it's kind of a subjective time of when people plow their fields for squashes and gourds. Se'ela b'sdei alavan, rather when it comes to wheat, ad ha Pesach, it is until Pesach v'sdei ilan ad atzeres, and by a sdei ilon, by a field with trees, it is until Shavuos, like Beis Hillel had said. Alright, fine. That sounds very nice. V'amar B'Shimon ben Pazi, it says B'Shimon ben Pazi, Amar B'Shua ben Levi, okay, the name of B'Shua ben Levi, Mishum bar Kapara, okay, name bar Kapara. Rabbi Gamliel uveis dino, Rabbi Gamliel in his bezdin, his court, Nimnu al Shnei Prakim Alalu, they decided about these two sort of periods by the Stei Halavon and the Stei Ha'ilon, right, which we said are Pesach and Shavuos respectively. So Uvitlu, and he was mevatel them. Right, that we saw a few minutes ago, that Reb Shimon had said that when it comes to the wheat field and when it comes to the tree fields, so you got to stop working them already from Pesach or from Shavuos. But says Reb Shimon ben Menasya, says Reb Shimon ben Pazi, that Reb Gamliel and his bezdin, they decided that no, this whole, having to stop before Pesach or Shavuos, forget about it. But Reb Zera says to Abo, some taka say it's Rish Lakish says to Reb Yochanan, how could Rabbi Gamliel and his bezdin be mevatel what Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel said about having to stop working your field from Pesach and from Shavuos? V'otnan, but we learn in the Mishnah, Ein bezdin yochel levatel divrei bezdin chaveru, elim ken gadol menu chachma v'minyan. That we learn in the Mishnah Let's read it again. Ein bezdin yachol levatel divrei bezdin chavero. One court is unable to nullify that which a different court established, elim ken, unless gadol mimenu b'chachma u'v'minyan. You have to be greater in both wisdom and in number. And it's, the assumption is that Rabbi Gamliel and his court was not as great as Hillel and Shammai in their court, right? Rabbi Gamliel was a great grandson of Hillel. I mean, Hillel was one of the Zugis. Rabbi Gamliel was already, at the end of the Beis HaMikdash, a little bit after. So how could it be that Rabbi Gamliel and his court decided that even though Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel said that you have to stop working the fields Shavuos time, Pesach time, based on if it is Ste'elovin, Ste'ilon, but how could Rabbi Gamliel decide that that's null and void if the assumption is he wasn't quite on the level of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel? So Shtom Kisha Achada. So whether it's a Rabbo, whether it's a Yochanan, he was quiet for a minute or for a certain amount of time. Omar Le, and then he replied, Amor Kachisnu Benein. So I'll say that, this was how Hillel and Shammai set it up. That when they said that, right, that when Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai said that you already have to stop working the fields from Pesach, from Shavuos, this was what, right, they baked into that, Kol HaRotze Levato Yavo Vivato, that if anybody at a later point wants to say, forget it, it's null and void, you can continue working even after Pesach and Shavuos, then they're allowed to. So therefore, Rabbi Gamliel wasn't undoing what Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai said. Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai themselves sort of worked in this condition into their gezerah that anybody would be able to be mevatel in the future. But then, fact the Gemara, 1 second. But did we? Halamoch alach l'Moshe Misinai. But 1 second. Even that which Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel are saying that you have to stop working the fields earlier from already Shavuos, from Pesach, so they're not making that up. It's alach l'Moshe Misinai. The Amar of Asim, Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum of Nechuni, Ish Bigas Beis Chorsin is, I think, the third time we're seeing this brayso already. Esunetiyas Arov of Nisuchamayim alach l'Moshe Misinai. That when you have 10 saplings in a field, and they're young saplings, so you're allowed to plow the entire field. If it's 10 of these saplings in an area the size of a beisah, so you could plow the field all the way up to Shemitah, up until Shemitah. Arava v'nisuchamayim, as well as surrounding the mizbeach with the aravis on Sukkos and the nisuchamayim, the water libations on Sukkos. Halacha l'Moshe Misinai. These are all halacha l'Moshe Misinai. So what do we see? That these 10 netios, that these young saplings, you're allowed to plow the field up until Shemitah, but nothing else. I.e., that already from prior to Shemitah, unless you're a young sapling in a Eser Netios kind of field, you're already not allowed to be working the field prior to Shemitah. So Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel are not making this up. It's halach l'Moshe Misinai that already from before Shemitah we are not working the field. So Rabbi Yitzchak says, Rabbi Yitzchak Yigmiri halacha hilchas shloshim yom lifnei Rosh Hashanah. Well, the halach l'Moshe Misinai is just saying that for 30 days before Rosh Hashanah of Shemitah you stop working the land. V'asu hane, but then came Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel takun mi Pesach and Atzeres, and they said already from Pesach and from Atzeres, from Pesach and Shavuos already you should not be working the land. The isnu bedidu, but they worked into their sort of halacha kol harotz levatel yavo vivatel, and that anybody who wants to at a later date undo this, they are allowed to, and therefore Rabbi Gamliel and his court were allowed to undo that which Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel said, that already you stop working the fields from Sukkos and Shavuos. Ve'ane hilchasa ninu krai ninu. But now, fact the Gemara, 1 second. The fact that we bring in Shemitah early is not halach l'Moshe Misinai, it's psukim. Ditanyas, we learn in the Brayso, b'charish v'akotzer tishbos, that it says that you have to refrain from plowing and refraining from harvesting. Now, why is it specifying these things? We already know that, what does the pasuk say? Sheishes Yom Tavud Vayom Hashvi Tishbos B'charish V'Kotzer Tishbos. In the context of Shabbos, it says B'charish V'Kotzer Tishbos that don't plow and don't harvest. So the question is, why do you have to mention not plowing and not harvesting? We already know you can't do any malacha on Shabbos. Why specify planting and harvesting? So Reb Akiva Omer says, Reb Akiva ein tzorich lo mecharish v'kotzer shel shvius, that it's not talking about Shabbos, because Shabbos we already says, right, you don't do any malachos. We don't need to teach that you can't plow and you can't harvest. Obviously you can't do any malacha on Shabbos. And it's not even talking about Shemitah, because Shemitah already also kind of talks about how you can't do any work of the ground. So what are we learning out from B'charish v'kotzer? So Rabbi Akiva Omer ein tzarich lo mecharish v'kotzer shel shvius shei kvar nemar sadcho l'sizah v'chaymecho l'sizma. It says, don't seed your field, don't prune your vineyard. El charish shel erev shvius shenichnas shvius. Rather, says Rabbi Akiva, what do we learn out from B'charish v'kotzer tishbos? It's talking about the plowing of erev shvius and the harvesting on motzai shvius. The plowing of shvius. Of Erev Shvius, that we don't plow the fields already once it's no longer for the 6th year but going to be for the next year. And also after Shemitah is over, any harvest from Shemitah, right, meaning if you're harvesting things that grew on Shemitah, so you have to treat them as Shemitah as well, i.e. that we add on Shemitah before Shemitah starts and after Shemitah starts. Rabbi Yishmael says, Rabbi Yishmael, so that no, actually this pasuk b'charish v'kotzer tishbos, keep it in the same context. It's talking about Shabbos, that you don't plow and you don't harvest on Shabbos. So machar is rishus, av kotzer rishus, and what we learn out from there is just like plowing is optional. You never have an obligation to plow. There's no mitzvah in the Torah where you have an obligation to plow for it. So av kotzer rishus. So therefore, what's not allowed on Shabbos is harvesting that is volitional harvesting. Yotza k'tzira omer she mitzvah, to the exclusion of harvesting the omer, the barley for the korban omer on the second day of Pesach. That is actually a mitzvah, and that is actually then doche Shabbos. So what do we see? So we see that according to Rabbi Akiva, we learn out from a pasuk of B'charish v'kotzer tishbos, that already from Erev Shemitah you have to stop plowing, and on Motzai Shemitah you can't harvest things that grew on Shemitah. So we see from Psukim that B'charish v'kotzer tishbos, we learn out from there that we add on to Shemitah. So it's not a halacha l'Moshe Misinai. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, ki gmire hilchasa lemishrei yalda, that what we need the halacha Moshe Misinai for is to teach the Eser Netios, that when you have 10 saplings in this area the size of a saw, so we say that so by these young trees, these young saplings, you'll be allowed to plow up until Rosh Hashanah, up until Shemitah starts. Krai, and what we learn out from the Psukim is Lemesar Zikena, is to say that older trees are not allowed to, you can't work, you can't plow the fields already starting from before Shemitah. So the halacha Moshe Misinai is saying that the young saplings you are allowed to plow up, or just up until Shemitah. And the pasuk that B'charish v'kotzer tishbos is teaching us that older trees you have to stop plowing and working already from before Shemitah. Now, in fact, the Gemara, but one second, I don't understand. If we're saying that the halacha Moshe Misinai is to say that specifically saplings you're allowed to plow the field until Rosh Hashanah, until Shemitah begins, well then doesn't that imply, automatically imply that older trees you would not be allowed to plow? So why do I need the pasuk to tell me that? I can know it from the inference of the halacha Moshe Misinai, Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Akiva. No, so rather, the halacha Moshe Misinai is for Rabbi Shmuel, because according to Rabbi Shmuel, B'charish v'kotzer tishbos is talking about Shabbos, halachos of Shabbos. And how does he know they have to add on to Shemitah? Well, that's from the halacha of Moshe Sinai. But according to Rabbi Akiva, it doesn't need the halacha of Moshe Sinai because he has b'charish v'katzir tishbos to say that you add on to Shemitah. Friends, that was Daf Gimel, Masechta Moed Katan. I think it was a very interesting daf. We saw another way how to answer the question of how could you irrigate a Beis HaShlachin on Shemitah. We saw yesterday the opinion of Abai. Well, it's according to Rebbe who says that Shemitah nowadays is only midar abanon, so you'd be allowed to irrigate the Beis HaShlachim so you don't lose out. And then we saw the opinion of Rava who says that no, it could even be according to the rabbis, meaning Abai said it was the opinion of Rebbe. Rava says that it's the opinion of the rabbis that even though they say Shemitah nowadays is midoraisa, but what's not allowed is avos, sort of the parent malachos, but the tolados would be allowed, and therefore that's why you'd be allowed to irrigate the Beis HaShlachin. And then we got into the interesting question of what happens if you plow on Shemitah. What's interesting about plowing is that it's not specified in the Torah that plowing is not allowed on Shemitah, but it is learned through klal ufrad uchlal. That sort of, that we learn out that plowing is not allowed because anything similar to sort of, seeding and pruning and harvesting is not allowed, and therefore that comes to include plowing as well. And the question is, what happens if you plow? Do we whip you or not? One opinion says yes, we whip you. The other one says no, we don't whip you. And the question is, how do we learn that out? So first we suggested that, well, maybe it's like Reb Ovenam, Reb Illa, that in this case we wouldn't actually say klal ufrad uchlal, because the klal is a positive commandment, the prat is a negative commandment. So we wanted to suggest that maybe the difference about whether you get malchus is whether we can treat plowing as a klal ufrad uchlal. And then we said everyone agrees that it is a proper klal ufrad uchlal, and that's why the opinion says that you get malchus says because it's included in the klal ufrad uchlal. The opinion says you don't get malchus is because the pasuk specifies, like pruning and harvesting, that only those things you get malchus for, but nothing else, not harvesting. And then we learned about adding on from Shemitah, to the year prior. We learned that there's like wheat fields and tree fields. That tree fields already you stop working at Shemitah, and wheat fields you stop working at Pesach. And then we saw a machlokus between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel that we've seen in the past about what do you learn out from b'charish v'katzir tishbos, because that pasuk isn't necessary. According to Rabbi Akiva, it teaches that you have to add on from pre-Shemitah and also after Shemitah with the harvesting things that were grown on Shemitah. That's what we learn out from b'charish v'katzir tishbos. Rabbi Shmuel learns it out in the context of Shabbos. And what he learns out, and the way that he learns out, Rabbi Shmuel learns out, that you're not allowed to work the field already prior to Shemitah is from Elach al Moshe Misina, that the 10, these 10 saplings in the field, you're allowed to plow them up until Shemitah begins, but not other things. Friends, that was Daf Gimel of Masechta Moed Katan. Hope you enjoyed. Peace out.